Much, Matt, and the audience for your time today. Let me just load up my PowerPoint slides and begin sharing. All right. So the title of my talk today is the epistemic case against industrial policy. So I think it's important to first define some key terms before we proceed. So industrial policy or industrial planning refers to interventions or policies of the state that target the transformation of economic structures to chase specific public goals. All right. So there is the term called structural transformation or structural change, which theorists in the literature use constantly. So what this means is that they are trying to steer the direction of the economy towards certain macroeconomic objectives, towards certain common goals that we should all strive towards. It could be innovation, it could be productivity, it could be climate transitions, by prioritizing certain sectors, firms, technologies, or production techniques over others. So there are a wide variety of instruments that include subsidies, but not just subsidies. There could be different loans and incentives. There could be tariffs, which are on the news a lot recently. Uh, there could be direct government investments, public-private partnerships. So what I want to stress today is that industrial policy is not just the ad hoc, issuance of a subsidy to a certain firm. All right, there could be a range of tools that are used by the state in order to steer the direction of the economy in a certain direction. Okay, and the defining feature here is the use of bureaucratic discretion to privilege a collective agenda over the diverse goals of individuals. So, important here, industrial policy generally refers to vertical industrial policy, where there is discretion exercised by the state to pick a certain technology, sector, a firm, or a certain project, as opposed to what people call horizontal industrial policy, which I believe is actually an oxymoron and contradiction in terms. Because horizontal industrial policy, according to some of the scholars, would refer to things like infrastructure or public goods. I don't personally consider these as industrial policy because these are general access goods that everyone can use in a neutral fashion. It does not require and involve, steering people or firms in a certain direction, to do things in a certain way, right? So to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting anyone, I want to quote here from Juhas and Roderick, who are perhaps, one of the leading advocates of industrial policies here. So they say it explicitly targets the transformation of the structure of economic activity to pursue some public goal. The goal is typically to stimulate innovation, productivity, economic growth. But recently, even sustainability and environmental objectives have been a target of industrial policy theories. And importantly, the key characteristic here is the exercise of choice and discretion by bureaucrats. Bureaucrats in Canada, in the UK, in the United States will say we will promote goal X, but not Y. We're going to promote electric vehicles. We're going to promote, green technology. We're going to promote American-made goods, right? So it's the exercise of discretion which defines industrial policies. So industrial policy is part of a long intellectual tradition, which is what we call structural political economy or structuralism in short. And this includes the likes of Friedrich List, Alexander Hamilton, Alexander Gerschenkron, heterodox economist Bryan Cheang, and they tend to see the economy in a very nationalistic and mercantilistic manner. So it is fundamentally opposed to the Smithian intellectual tradition, which sees wealth as a product of exchange, right? Product of impersonal exchange between people for the purposes of fulfilling the wishes of consumers. But structuralism and industrial policy theories instead see wealth as a byproduct of the productive assets of the nation. How much are you able to produce? What are your productive capabilities? That is much more important than a consumer centric framework. So the focus is on production rather than consumption. And as I will show you later on, this has some important implications. So the state has the power and the right to shape the direction. Notice this term direction, it keeps coming up. The direction of economic production to grow national wealth and power. So think of, the economy like a bus, right? And the government's like the bus driver driving and steering the economy in a certain direction. Okay? Historically, structural transformation has meant industrialization. In the 60s and 70s, many nations used industrial policy, and the transformation of the economic structure they were engaging in was trying to move economies from lower value added industries, perhaps agricultural or non manufacturing type, towards heavy industry, towards manufacturing, right? But that doesn't have to be the only type of structural transformation that they are trying to achieve. It can include any other goal. Today, usually in Western developed nations, it's not industrialization that they are trying to aim at, unless they're concerned about this thing called deindustrialization. But it could be, as I said, other objectives. In fact, many parties on the left wing politicians, they would want to have green industrial policy, right? Where they are trying to steer the direction of the economy towards a much more cleaner, environmentally friendly direction, in their opinion. So the approach I'm going to take today is that I'm not going to be focusing on cost benefit analysis. I'm not going to be engaging in quantitative studies to measure the effects and the impacts of industrial policy. In fact, I want to take a step back and go much deeper to deconstruct the theoretical foundation of industrial policy itself. I want to look at the underlying concepts of innovation, political economy, state market relations. And today, I'm going to be putting aside what we call public choice concerns. Public choice, I'm sure all of you know the term. It refers to challenges of incentives faced by political actors. It refers to challenges such as, rent seeking, interest group politics, regulatory capture, corruption. All these are serious problems that we encounter, in the world of public policy, especially when government intervention is heightened in the economy. But I'm going to be putting all of that aside today, not because they're not important, but because I think there is a much more, interesting and foundational aspect of analysis here, which is the knowledge related, epistemic related problems faced by central planners, faced by industrial policy makers. So the question I want to ask today is, how well can industrial planning engage in learning in a world characterized by radical uncertainty and complexity? So, in other words, I'm actually going to be focusing on what we may call the Hayekian challenge. In the tradition of F.A. Hayek, the Austrian school, challenges of knowledge and how it plagues central planning, even of the middle of the road variety here, industrial policy. And I'm going to investigate three responses that industrial policy scholars have raised to address this challenge. And I'm going to systematically show why they are inadequate in rising to the task. So first, let's very quickly recap what is the Hayekian contribution to political economy, right? Which stresses, epistemic dimensions, questions of knowledge, right? So the argument here generally is that, the knowledge that's relevant to economic coordination, that's relevant to, the choices that consumers, that firms, that entrepreneurs make, is dispersed and fragmented across society. It's not, concentrated in a single place that you can just dial a number, and then access and download all the information from a single source. It's not centralizable, right? It's like a jigsaw puzzle with a million pieces, and the shapes are always, turning and moving in a dynamic fashion, right? It's difficult to piece everything together and to have this, a bird's eye, overview of the economy with which you can then manipulate pieces on the chessboard to achieve some macro objectives. That's not how the economy works, right? And this is the Hayekian argument. So socio-economic phenomena, which includes the structures of the economy, which includes the techniques of production that firms use, which include, what a country is specializing in and what it's not specializing in. All these things are what we call spontaneous order, the result of human action, the choices of many different individuals, but not designed by any one single source. As such, we cannot predict with precision the future course of economic evolution. We cannot predict with precision what are the new technologies, what are the new consumer wishes that can rise up that can, suddenly spawn itself, in the coming months, in the coming years. We could be caught with genuine surprise at every single corner in the economy. And the reason why we would want competition in markets because it allows for trial error learning. In this environment of uncertainty, we allow different entrepreneurs, different consumers, and different actors to try out their own policies, their own plans, even if some may fail. And then collectively, we can learn from the mistakes of these actors and then refine our techniques as we go along. So the economy is not, some closed system. It's an open-ended system of experimentation that never comes to rest. We are always discovering, we are always learning, and and we are moving in some, in a very uncertain direction. So Hayek famously said that the economy is a voyage into the unknown. That's what competition and markets do, right? So how does this affect industrial policy, right? So the implications of centralized economic planning is fraught with dangers, as history has shown, 20th century has shown, right? And importantly here, it does not just affect comprehensive central planning, where the price system is completely abolished. It even affects middle of the road versions, which include industrial policy. Now, in industrial policy, the government does not abolish private property, it does not abolish prices, but the government is still exercising a high degree of discretion, as I have defined industrial policy just now, to decide certain directions that the economy is going to be heading towards, certain courses of actions that I'm going to use to steer firms and private actors in that chosen direction. Dynamic economic changes cannot be foreseen. Technologies, industry sectors can defy prediction. So the warning here is against making big bets on certain directions, right? So we want to allow for pluralistic decision making involving fragmented public bureaucracies, including private entrepreneurs, including civil society organizations. Now, importantly, this here does not imply market fundamentalism. Okay, this position I'm arguing here does not necessarily imply zero scope for government intervention. Okay, but it does imply that the state's role should be limited to horizontal policies, policies which are neutral in direction, which does not aim to steer firms and actors to do things in a certain way, right? Which is, general access, public goods, merit goods, right? As long as you have a very fragmented sort of a structure of governance, that is what allows for the trial and error learning to take place. Now, what are the responses that these industrial policy scholars have raised? There are three responses that I want to explore. Okay, and the first is the idea of mission directionality, and this is where the works of innovation scholar Meriden Matsukato comes into the picture. She is the famous author of a 2013 book called The Entrepreneurial State, and recently in 2021, a book called The Mission Economy, right? And here she states that private agents are paralyzed by uncertainty. And I quote here, they are like timid pussycats. Okay, this is not from me, this is actually from the book itself. And because of that, they're paralyzed, right? They're unable to make the long-term, the bold, courageous investments that you want. So because of that, the state should enter the equation and play the role of real tigers. A courageous tiger steering, leading, and marshaling the economy towards a certain direction, casting a collective mission for everyone to to follow. And lest I'm accused of misrepresentation, I want to quote here. She says, this transformation is necessary and it involves changing the relationship between public and private sectors and between them and civil society so that they all work symbiotically for a common goal. The reason for rethinking government is simple. Only government has the capacity to bring about transformation on the scale needed. Okay? So this is the case for an ambitious state, leading society towards a collective mission. Okay, another term for it is called the entrepreneurial state. Can inject this term that she likes to use called mission directionality, MD in short, mission directionality. Okay, historically, according to her, it was responsible for creating the internet. It was responsible for creating the atomic bomb during the Manhattan Project. It was responsible for sending a man on the moon. So these are ambitious projects led by the state. And we need this sort of ambitious state today because we are faced with bold problems and challenges, just such as climate change. So we need to restore this vision of the powerful and ambitious state. But the problem here is as follows. It does not actually solve the problem of uncertainty because there are many ways to tackle wicked problems, to tackle complex problems. Climate change is a problem, right? But climate change can imply a range of policies, can imply a range of solutions with no clear cut silver bullets or panacea towards it. But more importantly, it begs the question of what the chosen direction ought to be in the first place. What should society prioritize in the first place? Here's the issue, right? There is no objective yardstick to decide whether society ought to prioritize A, B, C, or D. There are a multitude of goals and missions that we all pursue on a daily basis. Matt, you have certain goals. I have certain goals, right? In a free and open society, we have diverse missions, right? And in the collective forum, usually these goals are negotiated, between people, between different stakeholders, and they are cycled through the democratic process, right? We don't say that, there must be one mission that we must permanently subject ourselves to, right? And even so, there is no objective yardstick because any politician and any stakeholder can present their preferred mission as the one that society should follow at that point in time, right? So there is a huge level of arbitrary value judgments involved with this casting of the mission. So when you argue for mission directionality and entrepreneurial states, what you're saying is that you want to replace the diverse decision making of people in a free society with an arbitrary value judgment of whichever interest group or whichever group is in power at that point in time. They get to decide what the mission ought to be, right? And in the end, you are legitimizing a system where democracy becomes a play ball of interest. What Hayek calls a play ball of interest, right? Where Bastiat calls it becomes a great fiction, right? Where we live at the expense of each other. We are all trying to capture the state to fulfill our own pet agendas, right? That is the problem. Now, in addition, she claims that the state was responsible for vast amounts of innovation in American history. It was not the private sector who were simply parasites actually of the government. Okay? She says, the iPhone, the touchscreen GPS technology, even the internet was actually invented by government. It was not the private sector, right? Now, here's the response. Okay. Um, we do not deny actually that many technologies like GPS or iPhone may be linked to government funding in the early stages. We don't have to deny that, right? But this does not mean, right, that the state was causally responsible for innovation, which is implied by mission directionality. Industrial policy and mission directionality requires and sees a state, right, as a foresighted actor, foreseeing the effects of his actions, right? I'm going to invest in 50 million, I'm going to do X, and then Y is going to happen in 10 years' time. But that's not how innovations work. That's not how many of these technologies actually emerged, right? So in fact, I want to quote here a historian called Price Fishback. And he writes here actually that actually in the United States, right, military funding, in the past actually did contribute, but as a spillover effect to the development of the commercial internet, yes, and a few other technologies as well, right? Especially, like NASA, lots of technologies were spawned as a spillover. This suggests actually that there was very little foresight. There was very little mission-oriented directionality behind the creation of these technologies, behind the creation of the internet, right? And moreover, actually, if you study some of the examples provided by Mazzucato, it tends to be a bit strange here because she as long as the state was involved in some part of the supply chain, the state can claim credit for it, right? So for instance, if Matt, you work in a government funded university, let's say, and tomorrow you invented some technology, right? Just the mere fact that you were employed in a government sector, therefore the government gets to claim credit for it. This is very strange, right? So let me give you an extreme example to illustrate this. So without the sun, right, I wouldn't be alive right now, and I wouldn't be able to speak to you, on the internet, right? But does that mean that the sun should be credited for the knowledge that I have and the webinar that I'm doing here? Right? Of course not, right? So the land on which that I'm standing on right now is managed and owned by the government. But does that mean that the state here, because I'm relying on government roads, that everything I'm doing here, the government gets to claim credit for it, right? Obviously not, right? But yet, this is the same sort of logic which she employs actually in the sort of history that she constructs, right? So in her 2013 book, she recounts a story of Dr. Wayne Westerman, who founded a private company when he was a PhD student in Delaware, right? And this guy, Dr. Wayne Westerman, he contributed to the early development of touchscreen technology, right? So apparently he founded a company to turn his PhD thesis into this technology. And Mazzucato claims, right, that just because he received government subsidies and funds, right, because he studied in a government institution. Therefore, because of this, it was the government that is responsible for the touchscreen technology that he developed over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, right? This is ridiculous. Okay. Um, Moreover, the same incentive and the same subsidy that could lead to success in one case can also lead to failure in another case, right? History is replete with lots of failures and successes of industrial policy, right? The evidence can be quite mixed and equivocal. So this implies here, right, that there are a range of lots of chance circumstances, right? Lots of historical accidents. They can contribute to outcomes in different contexts. Sometimes an intervention can lead to success. Sometimes it can lead to failures in many cases. So the point here, I'm not saying here that government industrial policy will always fail. That's not the claim. That will always be inefficient. That's not the claim. The claim is that even when we do see successes, these successes, right, cannot be easily replicated in a reliable way. The evidence of success itself does not constitute a reliable mechanism for innovation that we can replicate. You can't flick a switch 5 times and get innovations 5 times. Next, what is innovation in the first place? Right? I think there's a deeper question we must ask. What does economic theory actually tell us? Now, the economic problem, this is a distinction made by economist Lionel Robbins, is not a technological problem. It's not an engineering problem of maximizing a single objective X, whatever X may be. Now, governments can do that very well. It can channel massive resources towards the fulfillment of a single objective. The Soviet Union had nuclear technology, but it was an economic basket case. The state can produce a massive and stunning new spacecraft, for example, that travels at the speed of light X. You invest lots of resources, you kidnap the best scientists in the world and force them to work to produce this breakthrough technology. Yes, that's possible. We don't deny that. But if it does not make consumers better off, what is the point? What is the point? The economic problem, Econ 101, is about using resources to create maximum value for consumers while minimizing cost, right? So innovation is not inventing a superior technology, but it's about how to fulfill consumer demand better by doing more with less resources. right? So this is like standard economic theory. This is not even Austrian economics, okay? Now, this, however, requires the knowledge of opportunity cost to be revealed in prices. That's the function of the price mechanism. The problem here with state-led development, even this sort of like partial industrial planning, it prioritizes national production objectives over the wishes of consumers because the bureaucrats now get to decide with discretion what X should be. So, by that logic, right, discovery is stunted. The discovery of the market is stunted. Why is that so? Because we can never truly know how valuable the successes that we observed actually were in their alternative uses. Because this was not a byproduct of the dollar votes and the dollar valuations of consumers in the market. It was decided ex ante by the state. Therefore, we can never know in retrospect, even if we saw a stunning new spacecraft being developed, whether the use of resources into X indeed constituted the most efficient course of action. And indeed, we cannot observe the counterfactual. What value instead could have been generated instead in Y? Okay, so this is what Bastiat calls a seen the unseen, right? Government invests, government spends, and then you have this technology. You have a stunning new airport. We have this company doing very well, but you are sacrificing the value that could have been generated in a multitude of other directions, in a variety of other projects in the first place. Now, it also trivializes cost. Remember, as I said, the economic problem is not just about maximizing value, but about using value in an efficient way, which is reducing costs and maximizing the value from these resources. But here in the Mazzucato worldview, cost is a secondary. In fact, it's completely not important. And I quote her, she says, we must reject an obsession with the cost of our public services, which is the assumption that if we spend more in one area, we have to spend less in another. But that's just basically trade offs. If you even study one lesson in economics in high school, you know this is what we call trade offs, opportunity costs. But in Mazzucato's worldview, it's something that we must reject because it's an obsession. And she says budgetary allocation should come after to be formulated to help fulfill the mission to which it's allocated, whether it's putting a man at the moon or eliminating homelessness or building a carbon neutral city. So put the objective first, and even if it costs $5 billion, do it anyway. I didn't say this, I'm just quoting the text, okay? Accomplish the mission even at exorbitant cost. Okay? Now, I guess because of limited time, I'm just gonna be a bit quick in the next few parts. So I'm now gonna move on to the second response raised by industrial policy scholars. Their attempt to cope with uncertainty. So they say, okay, we can. So if government, civil servants, and bureaucrats are confronting a very uncertain future, where there's lots of uncertainty about technologies, about economic actions and coordinations, perhaps we can simply improve the knowledge that they have. We can improve their decision-making capabilities, right? Perhaps we can hire, smarter people in government. Perhaps we could use AI, right, and sophisticated technology and tools to forecast, to run scenarios. Perhaps we can use pilot programs to test certain techniques and projects before we roll it out across society. I have two responses. This is actually quite a simple one to respond to. Two responses. Number one, if there were some sophisticated techniques of decision making that have been discovered, then why do we need to limit their use to the monopolistic state? Wouldn't we want as many firms, as many centers of decision making in society to make use of these sophisticated techniques in the first place? Why couldn't we have diverse private agents also using these techniques? There is no reason to limit it to the monopolistic state through industrial policy. Response one. Response two. Indeed, if we introduce these sophisticated techniques into society, this does not eliminate uncertainty, but only shifts it to a greater order of magnitude. Okay? Now, if indeed, right, Many firms and entrepreneurs and ordinary people are using AI, let's say, okay, in their decision making, then this only compounds the level of uncertainty on a meta level. Unless you're saying that there is a meta level AI, that is a God's eye view over the individual users of AI, unless that's the case, which it is not the case, then the introduction of sophisticated techniques only compounds the problem of uncertainty and the knowledge problem that policymakers will face in the first place. It only shifts the problem up to a greater level and does not eliminate it. Okay, now that's the second aspect. Now, industrial policy theories have a third response. They say, okay, yes, we acknowledge that actually, in a world of uncertainty, right, markets play a very important role because there's decentralization, right? Decentralization actually provides trial and error learning, provides experimentation, so on and so forth. Perhaps we can mimic, how markets work, right? Perhaps industrial policy can also be decentralized. Perhaps we can have a form of decentralized industrial policy. Okay, let me quote some of the scholars in question. Mazzucato says a theory of innovation needs to be nested in a theory of learning, experimentation, adaptation to uncertainty. Okay, sounds good. Apparently, Danny Roderick says it must be framed as a process without a preconceived list of sectors and policy instruments. Mazzucato quotes, such an evolutionary perspective on policy must consider adaptation. Which policy is best in which environment will emerge from experimentation and trial and error. Hosman and Roderick expressed this best when they describe the need for a network like arrangement that may deliver what is required without any single node in the network being fully aware of all the things that are going on at any point in time. They talk a good game, but they do not walk the walk. Okay, let me explain. What does this really mean? Okay, what does this really imply? If all these words here are taken seriously, then this implies that there is no more macro steering at the top. Okay? If IP scholars generally allow for a devolution of decision making in a network fashion, then this implies, logically, by definition, implies limits on the ability of the superior node to steer and direct the network. Because if you're saying that there is a network and all nodes do not know what the other node's doing, then how can you have a superior node that knows what the other nodes are doing to steer them in a certain direction? You can't have your cake and eat it too. If individual states and private agents have genuine autonomy to dissent from the master mission and pursue their own diverging course, then this undermines mission directionality, which is the essence of industrial policy. Okay? Which is why, to unpack this argument a bit further, we have to understand a bit more on what we mean by mission directionality and the illiberal implications that it involves. Okay? If you truly emphasize the concept of mission directionality, which is the heart of Mazzucato's case, then diverging missions must be sidelined or brought into alignment. Okay? Let me give you some examples. In emergency scenarios, we have mission directionality. Okay, so think about war. In war, the whole society is marshaled towards a common mission. We mobilize society towards repelling the invaders, right? We achieve the mission even at exorbitant cost. And that's why usually in war, governments won't want to run like democratic elections during war, right? You do not want to have like democratic debate, discussion, disagreement during war. You want to have a centralized, unitary state to steer everyone towards the repelling of the invaders, right? Think about the pandemic response, right? During COVID, when society was marshaling and pulling together towards the common mission. And think also about the clamp down on dissent, right, that occurred in the wake of COVID, when certain individuals and groups offering a dissenting voice, challenging the conventional wisdom, they were sidelined. So now the point is that mission directionality is not necessarily a bad thing because if it's limited to certain if it's localized to certain points in time and in certain aspects of society, right? So, for instance, if you are in the military, you have to follow the chain of command, right? You cannot have two conflicting missions, right? If you are trying to run a military unit, you need to have you need to speak with a single voice, and all soldiers must pull in a single direction, accomplish the mission, right? But you do not want to run an entire society as if it's a military state. That wouldn't be good, right? So mission directionally contained, it's okay, it's normal. But here, Mazzucato wants to normalize mission directionality across society. Not only is that damaging from a knowledge perspective, it is also illiberal and undemocratic. Okay? So I've written a paper in 2024 showing actually that if you follow this logic to its logical conclusion, it requires the correction of dissent. Okay? And that's why, as I said, I quote her, in fact, all work symbiotically for a common goal. Okay? Now, notice here some incoherence in I want to quote another part of the book here. She says, oh, we are not trying to pick winners, but you should pick a direction. But when you pick a direction, then we can allow people to take a wide portfolio approach. Okay, not pick a technology or random sector, right? But a direction that can foster and catalyze new collaboration, so on and so forth. Not about picking winners, but picking the willing. Well, this is sort of like saying, we allow different drivers. You can drive different cars, you can use different maps and GPS systems, but you must all arrive, at the foot of the White House. Okay, that's what you're saying. And then look at the last phrase, not about picking winners, but picking the willing. What does that even mean? Obfuscation and incoherence. The willing do not need to be picked. There is nothing preventing private sector agents and government from engaging in private sector collaborations, from engaging in public private partnerships. The willing do not need to be picked. But if you try to pick the unwilling, your picking will go beyond mere picking. Look at some of these schizophrenia, actually, the incoherence in some of the words they're saying. Mazzucato says, on one hand, yes, we believe in evolution, trial and error, experimentation. But then she says, oh, the state is a meta entrepreneur and we must guide everyone according to a focal point, a guiding star. All work symbiotically for a common goal. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. Danny Roderick says, the more ambitious the goals of industrial policy are, the less government knows about the techniques available to solve them. Now, if you take this quote seriously, this implies an extremely modest role for the state. If you say the state shouldn't be so ambitious, therefore the opposite of ambition means modesty, right? So you should be very modest. But then in 2023, he writes with Mazzucato, the government should not only catalyze but direct growth, redesigning the direction of the economy from the ground up. This sounds very ambitious to me. Okay, would the real Danny Roderick please stand up? Right? So in the end here, right, okay, we need to engage in comparative analysis between state and markets. Okay, no matter how sophisticated, decentralized, or even networked the state may be, remember what is the state? The state is still defined as a territorial monopoly over legitimate decision making. Okay, so by definition, all of its rules in a given territory are singular. Okay, so here's the term that I use here, right? The state is limited to the serial processing of knowledge. No matter how smart the bureaucrats are, it can only try out one thing at one time. This is what we call serial processing of knowledge, right? But the market, because it is not bounded to a territorial monopoly, it is able to process knowledge in parallel. You have multiple diverse agents engaging their own trials simultaneously. Okay, now in conclusion, industrial policy makers face serious epistemic problems that render it unreliable as a mechanism to generate and replicate innovation that truly meet consumer ends. Both commercial failures and successes have been seen. The evidence is mixed, it's equivocal. It suggests that mission directionality, The idea that the state has intelligent foresight, can foresee in advance a good direction, and causally realize the outcome is an illusion. If consumers are concerned, then this requires knowledge of opportunity cost to be processed in parallel and competitive fashion. And also, attempts by IP scholars to mimic market conditions undermine their own desire to steer the system, right? In fact, right, they have steered themselves into a catch-22 situation, right? Either you want to steer the system, right, in which the state is occupying some synoptic position over the system in question, or the state is itself part of the complex system that is unable to steer. You cannot claim to wander in an unknown territory, but be determined to steer other people along it. Okay? And also, MD taken seriously is not fit for a plural society. Perhaps more relevant for authoritarian society, but not for free, open, democratic societies. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bryan. That was great. I'm going to remind people that if you want to ask a question, you can either raise your hand using the reaction button or type a question into the comment field. I will keep an eye on those. And also a quick reminder that today's book draw, because we do not have the form working on our new website right now, I will select someone randomly from our attendee list and email you to coordinate sending you a copy of Bryan's books, one of Bryan's books on institutions and economics. Bryan, I'll lead off the questions of one of my own, which is that I feel like, and I'm going to be biased here, when I see the results of attempts at industrial planning, it seems like they constantly fail. I spent a lot of time in Windsor, Ontario, where a lot of cars are built, and have watched, billions and billions of dollars being poured into auto subsidies. Steel factories shut down and lay off people, and it seems clear to me that this is a waste of money, and yet people don't seem to change their minds that much on industrial policy. Just today, Prime Minister Carney in Canada announced that they were removing the mandate for electrical vehicles that was introduced by the previous government. So all of these attempts by the government to, invest in the right sectors and predict what's coming seem to fail. And yet I feel like we're still often in a minority of people who notice this and want the government not to do it in the future. Do you have any explanation of why this sort of planning continues to be popular, even though we seem to see a lot of failures?
Okay, so that's a great question. Several responses. Number one, there are lots of failures with industrial policy, but I in my explanation and in the paper that I wrote, which this presentation is built on, it's not focusing on the failures, right? Because if you just raise the evidence of failures, then advocates of industrial policy can raise 5 examples of success, right? Then it just becomes like a numbers game. You have a failure, I have a success. With failure, I have a success, right? So I'm more interested in tackling even the best case scenario. Even when you seem to observe success, even then does not constitute a good reason to double down industrial planning. Does that make sense? So that's the approach that I'm trying to take here in my presentation, which is it's not that industrial policy will fail or tends to fail, even though I do believe a lot of these public choice challenges which cause these inefficiencies. But the point is that even if we see success, it's not a sort of success that you can replicate in a reliable manner, right? That's my first response. The second response, why is it that governments like to do this and people gravitate towards it? Because this is one of the things that allows politicians to claim credit when things seem to succeed, and also for politicians to be seen to be doing something. And also industrial policy, by injecting funds into specific sectors in technology, you could potentially create jobs relating to that sector in question. So because of that, right, there are certain constituencies and interest groups that the politicians can very easily appeal to and show that, guess what, I've created jobs for you. There were some manufacturing jobs lost. I'm able to restore that. Therefore, vote for me. So there are certain public choice political incentives that perpetuate the popularity of industrial policy. And also, just to say one more thing, there are lots of countries that have done it. For example, I come from Singapore, and people like to say the East Asian tigers, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, did industrial policy, and it was so successful. Therefore, we should learn from them. right? So that's a very big elephant for me to deal with. But I have written some of that in other works. I've shown actually, for example, in Singapore, it was some of the industrial policy led to lots of unintended consequences, right? Rather than lots of the benefits that people take for granted.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. I'm going to come to now to a question in the chat where the commenter asks, says, first of all, thank you for the insightful talk. I'm wondering if you could comment on the so-called China model for development for the perspective of industrial planning.
Okay, that's a very big elephant question as well. So China model, a few things. Number one, right? The China model today is a very strange mix of hyper competition and state-led planning. Okay, there are certain sectors in the Chinese economy here which are extremely competitive. So, for example, the car industry, right? Like you have BYD, right, which is a car company that has penetrated the different Western markets. There's like massive competition here where the barriers to entry are pretty low. So when people say, "Oh, let's copy the China model," my question is that which part of it, right? Certain parts are very competitive, certain parts are very common, especially the areas which are dealing with utilities, the strategic sectors, and the sectors which have some sort of military application, right? So that's one thing. People like to say, oh, it was industrial planning, but there's lots of competition as well in certain areas that perhaps that's the part that we should be learning from. Number two, about China model, right, which relates also to the East Asian model. That's the thing um, that I've been talking about. There are two responses you can give. Number one, you can focus on some of the inefficiencies, the harms, and unintended consequences that occurred. And there are certain books and papers which I can recommend that show you that the practice of industrial policy in these cases were not unmitigated successes, as some of these scholars actually claim. But the second response that actually I want to emphasize more here, which is more important, think about the implications for liberal democracy. It is no coincidence that China is is using this industrial planning, right, and they are an authoritarian state. Okay, now Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, these East Asian tigers, right, at the height of the developmental state model, they were authoritarian. Okay, if you truly care about liberal democracy, you cannot subject society to a common mission, which is exactly what the East Asian developmental states and China actually did. Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan. Except that the goal in question, the mission in question was economic growth. We were trying to spearhead and catalyze industrialization, right? So therefore, we engaged in this massive mobilization of society in order to achieve that. Regardless of what the success is, right, that's a secondary issue. My concern is more about the implications for a free, open, and democratic society. GDP to me is secondary. For me, it's individual liberty that's more important.
Great. Thank you. Vaughn has a quick follow-up to that. Do you have any books that you can recommend for reading about the China model?
Yes. So the best book that I recommend is on China's economic history and development would be by economist Huang Yasheng, called Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics, written in 2008. And this economist, Huang Yasheng, has a new book actually coming out this year called Statism with Chinese Characteristics. And very quickly to summarize, that 2008 book argues that China's economic success actually had roots in a more grassroots version of capitalism, which where lots of these reforms sprang up in a very bottom-up manner. And in the second phase of economic reforms, it was replaced by a more technocratic top-down version. And that second stage, right, led to lots of distortions, led to lots of the authoritarian, consequences that we still do see today. So some of this careful historical analysis, I think, is quite constructive.
Great. Thank you. Alex's hand raised. Go ahead, Alex.
All right. Thanks for that, Brian. I just want to ask a little bit, like you talked about there's one side you talked about mission direction quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of just ask, so you said it was okay at a local level, and yes, I think it's just necessary to happen at a local level, but like where's the line on that? Like especially in regards to industrial policy, where's the line where okay, a locale like at a local level we decide something, even maybe like a like with the river or something. But like where, at what stage does that become then kind of illiberal?
Okay, so that's a very good question. So I think there isn't a formula, there isn't a specific level at which suddenly the illiberalism comes about. So I would say the more local it is, the smaller the scale of government intervention, the less scope for abuse, the less scope for systemic error, the less scope for massive collapse, right? So the extreme is where you have like a Soviet Union, like central planning, right? So you want whatever government interventions or government policies, if you think they are necessary, to be done, as modestly as possible, right? So, perhaps on a state level, on a sub-state level, that's okay. But I think the other issue here is that even now, my argument is that as long as it involves political discretion, I don't think there should be mission directionality unless there is a genuine collective emergency. For example, there is like a pandemic that you're faced with. Perhaps you are truly invaded by a foreign country and need to mobilize nation for war, right? If there isn't a genuine emergency, then I don't think even a state or even a village or something like that should mobilize that village or a state around a collective mission, right? Because when it comes to politics, you are involving the use of coercion over people's lives, right? So you want to maintain an open, diverse sets of ends for people as much as possible. But of course, in civil society and in the non-coercive sphere, you could have lots of very localized mission directionality, right? Like your institute, right, has a certain mission, right, to educate Canadians, for example, in right. That's a mission. That's okay. But when it comes to politics, which involves coercion, that's where I'm a bit skeptical and worried about its implications.
Right. Thanks, Brian. Konstantinos is curious, would you rank Germany, modern Germany, as having industrial policies in place or not?
Yeah, yes. So I would say actually most countries, most Western developed countries have some level of industrial policy. So I'm not an expert on the German economy, but I do know, and I can safely say that Germany has industrial policies. Now, the question is that to what extent is this different or similar from the American variant? To what extent, is the German form of industrial policy, reflective of like top-down mission directionality? I'm not sure. That's a question that's actually worth checking and exploring. I would say that actually most industrial policies, right, um, do not reflect the ideal of mission directionality in Mazzucato. Because if it were, right, I think that would be much more dangerous. I think the East Asian model does reflect that a lot more because countries like Germany, USA, France, UK, these are democratic countries. So even the industrial policies that we do see, right, it'd be very hard to create the sort of top-down mission directionality as you would see in like an Asian context, where collectivism and communitarianism is the norm. Now, I would say that the industrial policy in the United States recently is quite different from the European version. A lot of the European version, what we can classify that as perhaps left wing industrial policy, which is focused on like not sorry, on sustainability. Okay, so building solar panel, investing in electric vehicles, shoring up energy capacity, right? So it's that form of industrial policy that Europe is quite big on, right? So we know that Germany like sort of decommission all of its nuclear power plants, right, in recent years, which personally I think that was horrible. So that's a more, we can call it a progressive variant of industrial policy as compared to perhaps a Donald Trump version of industrial policy, right, which is focused more on, shoring up American industries, revitalizing, homeland productive capabilities. Does that make sense? So actually, this teaches us something here, which is that both sides use industrial policy, right? People on the left, people on the right. It's not unique to a certain part of the political spectrum, right? Remember, industrial policy is the use of discretion to steer the economy in a certain direction. The left have a certain ideal direction they want to steer the economy towards. The right also have a certain direction they want to steer society towards, and they will use these sort of tools of public policy to incentivize, cajole, in extreme cases, harass private actors towards their desired directions, right? But as a classical liberal, I don't believe that society should be steered, right, in a macro and a top-down fashion. You steer your own life.
Right. Thanks, Brian. I think this will be our last question. I'm going to ask Dwaryu to go ahead and apologize for probably mispronouncing your name.
I know it was actually pretty close, it's fine. Uh, uh, yeah, so essentially, my question is like, what would you say constitutes that level of crisis that you were talking about?
Yeah,
Like currently, the idea that that I support that we're in like the great power competition against China
yeah,
and the growth of like authoritarianism and this the like like all this industrial policy of like helping technology and all of these things grow to compete with China economically.
yeah,
And
yeah,
talking about you're having the liberal ends with essentially the idea is that the fight is for to preserve liberalism, that if China wins the great power competition, liberalism fails. So is it okay to break that rule slightly here for the long term,
yeah.
preserving it?
Okay, that's a great question. It's a very difficult one to answer. There's lots of truth in what you said, but it's very difficult to operationalize. Okay, so I am concerned about China. I'm worried about China. I believe that China is a malign actor, and Western developed nations need to be careful of China, right? But it does not mean, right, that you somehow become China. You see, in your desire to counter China, to follow this China model and transplant it yourself, right? Because if you want to preserve freedom, you don't destroy freedom entirely because you are stepping on the very ideals they're trying to defend. Okay, so that's my first response. Second response is that it depends on what is the nature of that threat, right? If you're talking about a genuine military threat, okay, if you are Taiwan and China is breathing it down your neck, then I think there is a stronger case for military mobilization. Okay, but if you are like literally a continent away from China, then you cannot claim that there's a genuine military threat at your doorstep. You see what I mean? But I don't have a hard and fast rule. That has to be decided collectively within democracy. People need to vote. If you believe that there's a war, Congress and your political representatives must declare war. You can't just have Donald Trump or some political executive say, "This is an emergency. I'll sign an executive order," and then I like commit the entire society to this war, right? The language of emergency today is so very easily abused all the time, right? Think about COVID and things like that. Now, last point from the implication of industrial policy, right? Here's the interesting part. Should the government perhaps fund steel plants? Should the government fund, like weapons factories, right? Personally, I think that's one area that I may be a bit sympathetic to, where you may not want to perhaps rely on pure comparative advantage, right? To rely on, when it comes to domestic military capabilities, right? But where do you draw the line? Does that mean that you have to conscript and draft engineers in society? Does that mean that because higher education institutes, right, can contribute certain technologies downstream, which can enhance your military capacity, that therefore the government should nationalize, and run the universities in a command manner? I'm not sure. You see what I mean? Is if you because if you use that emergency logic, right, then it's a step towards simply saying the entire society needs to be collectively marshaled, you see. So I don't have an easy answer to that except to say that perhaps some procedural guardrails will help us against the abuse of this emergency discourse.
Wonderful. Hey, Brian, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. It's an important and timely discussion. And unfortunately, I think that your work pointing out the problems with industrial policy will always be relevant and needed, and something that we need to point out there. So I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank all of our guests for coming and taking the time to join us. Hope to see you again soon at one of our webinars or other ILS events. Till then, hope you have a great rest of your day, rest of your week, and a good weekend. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian.